relations. She was a big supporter of the chief of police at Manchester, who called AIDS and HIV a gay plague, and was utterly opposed to any type of same-sex relation. In contrast, Tony Blair believed and tried to introduce a so-called modernisation of the moral framework of the law, and gay marriage was finally legalised in Britain in 2005. So very different approaches to the whole issue of the whole sort of moral cultural question between Thatcher and Blair. What unites both of their administrations really was the idea that increasingly it was left to the individual to make their own types of ethical choices, and that the best place where individuals could make ethical choices was in the marketplace, that the market allowed people to exercise their ethical powers. And I'm going to give you one example of that to try and make that make sense, which is the body shop phenomenon. Okay, now the body shop had actually been a Berkeley Telegraph Avenue creation. Anita Relic, comes over here, sees this little shop, goes back to Britain and sets up the first body shop in Brighton in 1976. And as you know, the body shop is basically selling cosmetics that weren't tested on animals. So it was part of this, emancipation of commercial practices from all the bad ways of like the fair trade, the growth of fair trade shops and all the rest of it. By 1982, the body shop was opening 2 shops a month. It went public. That is to say, it became part of this enormous growth of the financial sector in 1985. And by 1990, opens in the US and now operates in 39 countries. It's a perfect example of the way that we now as consumers try and make decisions rather than the government telling us how it is that we should act. We believe that by buying the right types of products, we can exercise our own ethical choices. And this, as I'm trying to emphasize, was an enormously important trend in the 80s and 90s on both sides of the Atlantic. This seeding increasingly of individuals to try and govern their own communities and their own choices through Neighbourhood Watch or through the types of cosmetics they buy is often associated with the end of politics as we used to know it. And it's certainly true that the organised system of party politics in Britain took a bit of a beating during the 1980s and 1990s. You can see in these 2 graphs basically the declining levels of turnout at elections, and you can see in these graphs at the bottom the declining numbers of members of the Conservative Party and of the Labour Party. So that effectively Britain no longer has mass political parties, and its levels of turnout are reaching almost American standards, although actually it goes to, back to 70% in 2010. I think this argument can be overplayed. For sure, I think that mass political parties don't really play a key role anymore in the way that they had done since the 1870s. But it's certainly the case that a whole series of other groups have formed in order to protest and to influence government in particular areas. So you can think, for instance, of the enormous growth of the NGO sector and the way in which NGOs lobby governments over particular policies without a mass membership. Or you could think of the wave of sort of mass political demonstrations that have unfolded in Britain in the beginning of the 21st century. The Thatcher governments constantly confronted large numbers of protesting citizens, either in terms of strike action, student protests against the poll tax, the introduction of a new type of local government tax. And in the 21st century, there was a huge 1 million strong march against the Iraq war. The Countryside Alliance in 2002 led an enormous demonstration against the abolition of fox hunting. And of course, the student protests in 2009 through to 2011 showed that even students have some life on the streets left in them. So politics doesn't disappear. It's just changing shape. And in many ways, one of the key features of the way in which it's changed shape is that people are no longer joining political parties, but they're making a much more flexible series of decisions about political action through individual causes or individualized protests. Okay, I'm going to finish by talking to you about the Millennium Dome experience. So, the reason why the Millennium Dome experience is important is because it was a big pet project of the Blair administration to celebrate the millennium in 2000. And it was quite self-consciously seen as a counterpart to the Great Exhibition of 1851 and the Festival of Britain in 1951. And just as, arguably, the Great Exhibition and the Festival of Britain had showcased the new liberal era of free trade and the new social democratic society that the Labour administration wanted to produce, so the Millennium Dome experience, I'm going to suggest, shows the way in which neoliberalism had become consolidated in Britain. It was a classic case of trying to redevelop an urban area that had been effectively redundant since the collapse of the docking industry in London, but to regenerate it through private investment. That is to say, to set up a commercial company that would attract private forms of investment and private forms of capital. That was the Millennium Dome Experience Company Limited. Unlike the Festival of Britain, that had, you'll remember, that very sort of didactic series of attempts to try and showcase the nature of life and the new modernised technological life of social democratic Britain, the Millennium Dome experience had 7 separate pavilions that tried to reflect upon the nature of life in Britain at the dawn of the 21st century. It had a spirit level that was a place for peace and personal reflection. Established religion, organised religion is out of the question. This is a much more spiritualised understanding of the individual and of spiritual life. The Living Island, a pavilion, tried to showcase forms of environmental protection and the centrality of environmental protection, pretty important given that it's on, like the Olympics, on a big floodplain right next to the River Thames. The Serious Play pavilion was an attempt, and here we have some nice parallels with 19th century liberalism, was an attempt to show how leisure can reactivate your life. Okay? How it was that you could rebuild yourself through leisure pursuits, not least through exercise, healthy exercise. The Learning Curve pavilion tried to showcase learning as a lifelong process. So how everybody can continually be part of this learning environment to create a flexible type of labour force able to retool itself at any moment. And finally, the horrible learning to skill play on the James Bond thing for hidden skills for the new world of work. So you can see the way in which these pavilions in many ways tried to nicely reflect the new emphasis upon the individual, and upon the individual not as someone who was going to be embedded in a job for life, but an individual who had to flexibly reimagine and redeploy themselves in a completely different type of economic and cultural system. What about the last one? What was the last one? Oh, the dreamscape. That was... What was Dreamscape? I forget what Dreamscape was. I think it was about culture industries. I think it was about, I think it was a showcase of the culture industries in Britain. Okay, let me wrap this up at 12:23. I'm tired, so you must be exhausted and bored. So, I want to emphasise that this isn't, or hasn't been a lecture about Britain going back to the future. I haven't been trying to suggest that neoliberalism was simply a revival of the forms of liberalism in the 19th century, that it was something that looked and was enacted in fundamentally different types of ways. But the really important point I want to leave you with is to remind you that this is part of this general sequence of transformations that I've been trying to get at throughout the course of the class. This transition from the ancient regime through to liberalism, through to social democracy, through to this thing that I've been calling neoliberalism. In each of these areas, I've been trying to emphasize that there has been part of a more general transnational process. I wouldn't describe it as a global process, but many of these forms of political economy that are apparent in Britain were apparent in other parts of the world. And indeed, I would suggest, came in important ways at moments of important political and economic restructuring. So you can think of the 1760s, perhaps, the 1790s, the 1840s, the 1870s, the 1920s and 30s, the 1940s, and the 1970s and 1980s. There are moments there of key geopolitical or political or economic crisis that help mediate these transitions, not just in Britain, but across much of the Euro-American world. Nonetheless, what I've been emphasising all the way through this class is that these take have a very specific British flavour. There are peculiarities to the ways in which these systems develop in Britain. And my point in doing that is not just to be able to say, look, there's something specific about each national story that we have to understand its development. I've also been trying to suggest to you throughout the class that even though we now seem to be stuck in this this current era of neoliberalism, just as people in the 50s or 60s felt stuck in the system of social democracy, or people in the 19th century felt stuck in the liberal era, or people in the 18th century felt stuck in the ancient regime, the point is that these systems change. They are all not just products of history, they all eventually become historical objects themselves. Okay, so the point of the class as a whole is that this series of transitions is not something that we simply have to observe as historians. We do importantly need to observe them, and we have to understand how they change over time and when they change over time, but it's also the case that we have to recognise their impermanence, that how it is that we think that the world has to be organised now isn't the only way of organising the world. Okay? That basically, as historians, you are charged with being able to rethink our present by studying our past. You can change history just as much as you can study it and get an A in the final exam. And on that uplifting note, I will leave you and see you next Tuesday for the fabulous student presentations. And my apologies for what I said, did warn you about was going to be an unbelievably condensed and incoherent lecture. Thank you.